All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're going to look at one of the absolutely most famous figures in all of human history, but we're doing it strictly through the lens of a professional historian. When we hear the name Jesus of Nazareth, we almost instinctively think of theology or global religion or deeply held personal faith. But what actually happens when we strip away all those centuries of tradition? What if we examine this figure solely using the rigorous, completely impartial tools of historical methodology? How do historians actually analyze ancient primary sources to uncover the man behind the massive movement? Well, let's find out.
But hold on a second. Before we can even begin to separate the man from the movement he inspired, we really need to ask ourselves a fundamental question. How do we actually know anything about ancient figures at all? In antiquity, we obviously don't have photographs or birth certificates, right? We have to rely on textual artifacts, archaeological findings, and cross-referencing ancient accounts. So to figure out what the historical record actually says, we literally have to treat all ancient writings, whether they're secular or religious, as primary documents that are subject to really intense historical scrutiny.
For this explainer, here is our game plan. We'll cover the historical Jesus problem, check out the extra-biblical primary sources, look at the early Christian textual evidence, break down the scholarly consensus, and finally analyze those famous resurrection claims.
Okay, jumping into part 1, the historical Jesus problem.
And right into section 2, extra-biblical primary sources.
To build a truly objective foundation here, we're going to start our investigation from the outside in. We're looking at the artifact evidence. The historical record actually contains 22 extra-biblical texts written within 150 years of his life, and among the most crucial are Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian whose purest Arabic manuscripts confirmed Jesus had a lot of disciples and was condemned to crucifixion by Pilate. Then we have Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian, and Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor who actually documented early Christian gatherings. And here's the thing. Because these writers were basically hostile, or at best, completely indifferent to the movement, their corroboration is absolute gold to historians.
Let's actually look at the exact words of that Roman historian, Tacitus. He wrote this in his Annals to describe the totally hideous burning of Rome under the Emperor Nero. And in it, we find a brief but incredibly crucial secular mention of Jesus. Now, Tacitus absolutely despised Christians. He called their movement a mischievous superstition. But honestly, that actually bolsters his credibility as an independent historical source. He had zero reason to just invent a historical founder for a group of people he genuinely loathed.
So why does this matter? Well, this purely Roman perspective independently establishes a precise historical framework. Just from Tacitus alone, historians can verify that Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. They can verify the movement originated in Judea, took a temporary hit with his execution, and then just explosively spread all the way to Rome.
But we don't just have Roman sources, we also have Jewish records compiled between 18 and 200 AD. Specifically, we're talking about the Talmud, which totally corroborates the execution, but offers a completely different, fascinating perspective on his miracles. And remember, these records were written by religious leaders who vehemently opposed the early Christian movement.
What do historians actually extract from a text like this? A few vital facts. First, it confirms the timing, the eve of Passover. It mentions hanging, which interestingly enough uses the exact same Greek root word used elsewhere in antiquity to describe crucifixion. But the most fascinating part, it actually acknowledges his unexplainable acts. But notice the framing here. Instead of viewing these acts as some divine power, the Talmud frames them critically as sorcery. For a historian, that is incredible. It means even his fiercest detractors admitted he did things they literally couldn't naturally explain. They just completely disagreed on where that power came from.
Moving on to section 3, early Christian textual evidence.
Okay, so we've examined the secular artifacts. Now we turn to the early Christian texts. And we're evaluating them not as inerrant scripture, but purely as ancient literary sources subject to strict historical scrutiny. When we map all of this evidence chronologically, a really fascinating picture emerges. You've got the crucifixion around 30 to 33 AD. Within just a few decades, between 50 and 95 AD, the canonical Gospels and Paul's letters are composed. And then shortly after that, we get the writings of Josephus, Pliny, and Tacitus. Listen, in the study of ancient history, having multiple independent sources documented within roughly a century of the actual events, that is highly, highly significant.
And that brings us to the canonical Gospels themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. While these texts serve as the foundational theology for literally billions of people today, the professional historian views them first and foremost as primary documents.
And what they find when they read them is that the Jesus portrayed through the unbiased, secular historical record bears an almost uncanny resemblance to the Jesus depicted in these gospel accounts, at least when it comes to the timeline of his life, his followers, and his death under Roman authority.
Let's look at Section 4, the scholarly consensus.
So, what happens when we actually put the secular and religious texts side by side? Well, a very clear divide emerges between established history and ongoing debate. On one hand, we find nearly universal historical assent on a few key things. Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, he acted as a teacher with a substantial following, and he was undeniably crucified by Pontius Pilate. However, there are points of intense scholarly contention too. Things like the specific details of his burial. Was he placed in a specific tomb by a man named Joseph of Arimathea, or was he just thrown into a common grave? And of course, the historical validity of the empty tomb itself remains hotly debated.
As scholar James Dunn brilliantly points out, the non-Christian confirmation of the crucifixion is so firmly established that it literally serves as the absolute starting point for any serious historical study of Jesus. Even secular scholars like Bart Ehrman fully agree that the crucifixion of Jesus on the orders of Pontius Pilate is the absolute most certain element about his life.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, analyzing the resurrection claims.
We really have to address the most famous, and without a doubt, the most contested claims surrounding this figure, the resurrection. I mean, how does a historian even begin to analyze a claim that a man physically rose from the dead? Well, here is where we hit the absolute limit of secular historical methodology. Historians rely on natural explanations for natural events. They can completely document the belief of early Christians. They can verify that the disciples genuinely claimed to have seen the risen Christ and that they were literally willing to die for that belief. But verifying a supernatural event itself, that falls entirely outside the scope of academic history.
To maintain historical objectivity, we have to draw a very hard line here. History confirms the consensus. The disciples had profound post-mortem experiences that they interpreted as seeing Jesus. That unshakable belief spurred rapid missionary activity and resulted in severe persecution. However, the belief in a concrete physical resurrection of a transformed body, the idea that Jesus is God incarnate, or the concept of atonement for sin, those remain strictly matters of faith and theological doctrine. They just aren't verifiable historical facts.
Because historians can't verify the supernatural, they hyper-focus on analyzing the natural events surrounding the days right after the crucifixion. And the physical details of that burial remain subjects of massive debate among secular and liberal Christian scholars. Did the Romans actually allow his body to be taken down before sunset to honor Jewish law, or was he left on the cross to decay? Was he buried in a known, specific tomb, which would make an empty tomb narrative actually verifiable, or was he just cast into a common dirt grave, making the whole discovery of an empty tomb a later theological addition?
So, while Orthodox Christians firmly hold to a material, physical resurrection, secular historians take a very different approach. They largely attribute the totally explosive growth of early Christianity not to a literal empty tomb, but to the powerful visionary religious experiences of his early followers. It was these intense, subjective experiences, historians argue, that gave them the drive to boldly proclaim his exaltation.
So, what does this all mean? It leaves us with one final, truly remarkable question. Regardless of your personal beliefs about his divinity or whether you view the resurrection as a literal physical reality or a profound psychological event, the evidence leaves us totally pondering. How did a single, impoverished historical figure, executed in the most humiliating way possible in a dusty outpost of the Roman Empire, manage to fundamentally alter the course of human history, art, culture, and even time itself? It's an absolutely huge question, and it's one that historians, theologians, and seekers are going to be wrestling with for centuries to come.